Back in the 90s, fresh out of high school, I had no real plans for college. Instead, I jumped straight into the workforce, landing my first full-time job as a night auditor at a small hotel. If you're unfamiliar with the role, it involved everything from checking in guests to handling wake-up calls and balancing accounts for the night. I was just 19, lazy like most kids my age, but I actually enjoyed the job. Well, most of the time. Some nights, however, were different. Some nights were terrifying. This is the story of the scariest night of my life. To set the scene, the hotel looked like something straight out of a thriller movie, an aging roadside inn with a covered drive-in at the check-in desk, leading to a parking lot surrounded by 3 floors of rooms. Despite the 3-story structure, I was strictly instructed never to check anyone into the top floor, due to strange occurrences in the past. But that's a tale for another time. The layout was relatively open. From the front desk, I could see almost every room except for a few blind spots near the building corners. My shift included occasional walkthroughs, checking ice machines, and making sure everything was in order. And that's where my story begins. A quiet Monday night. It was a slow, freezing Monday night, one of the slowest of the season. I had just finished my routine walkthrough and settled back into the office behind the front desk, doing some paperwork. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something on the security monitor. A man. Dressed entirely in black, he stood just out of view from the front windows, looking around as if checking for witnesses. Something about the way he moved sent a shiver down my spine. I kept watching. Then, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a black ski mask. The face behind the glass. My stomach dropped. I didn't see a weapon yet, but I didn't plan on waiting around to find out. I knew what was about to happen. Springing to my feet, I bolted for the front door. The man saw me move, and we both rushed toward it at the same time. My heart pounded as I slammed the deadbolt shut just as his hand reached for the handle. He froze. Behind the thin layer of glass, I could see his expression shift from surprise to anger. His mouth, visible through the ski mask, twisted into a sneer of frustration. In my nervousness, I couldn't help but smirk, feeling a ridiculous sense of triumph. Then he raised his hand, and I saw the gun, frozen in fear. My smugness disappeared instantly. The barrel of the revolver stared straight at me. He cocked the hammer back. The cylinder turned with a metallic click. Time slowed. He pressed the gun against the glass, his finger tightening on the trigger. My entire life, 19 short, uneventful years, flashed before my eyes. I was about to die. That's when I lost control. I won't lie. I peed myself. My mind screamed at me to run, to hide, to do something, but my body refused to move. I was frozen, paralyzed by sheer terror. Then I closed my eyes. I accepted my fate. I waited for the shot, but it never came. Gone. Without a trace. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I finally opened my eyes, he was gone. The adrenaline drained from my body, leaving me weak and nauseous. My knees buckled and I collapsed into a chair nearby, head between my hands, struggling to breathe. Had he taken pity on me? Had the gun not been loaded? Had something scared him away? I had no answers, but at that moment I didn't care. I was alive. That's all that mattered. For a fleeting second, I thought about calling the police. But what could they do? I hadn't seen his face, and by now he was probably long gone. Instead, I made a decision. I was done. I finished my shift, changed my pants, and quit the next morning. A wake-up call out of courtesy, I told my boss about the attempted robbery. Then I walked away from that job and never looked back. That spring, I enrolled in community college. 2 years later, I transferred to a major university in California, eventually earning an MBA. Over the years, I worked for various corporations across Southern California and Nevada before finally starting my own consulting business. It took a man with a gun to make me realize I needed to change my life. So, to any young person unsure about their future, if you truly believe college isn't for you, that's fine. But be very sure, because one day you might find yourself staring through a sheet of glass at someone who didn't get a second chance. And in that moment, you'll wish you had. Recently, I was rewatching The Civil War, a PBS documentary by Ken Burns made in 1990, which, of course, covers the war between the North and South in the mid-19th century. Watching it again reminded me of a terrifying incident I experienced almost 25 years ago. While the event itself didn't involve ghosts or supernatural creatures, it was just as mortifying as any horror story. At that point in my life, I was living in Chambersburg, a small town in Pennsylvania, not far from the state capital, Harrisburg. I was visiting various towns and cities in South Carolina and Georgia to research a historical novel I was writing, set during the Civil War. My trip was moving into its second week after I took a longer than expected stop in South Carolina to visit a former sorority sister. Once I got back on track, my research was progressing quickly, and I hoped to make it home by the end of the month as planned. Now, I understand that many people today might not relate to this, but at the time, the internet was still in its early days. Most of the information that's now readily available online simply wasn't back then. If you needed to compile a large amount of research on a particular area or event, you had to physically go there and pore over records. Books could provide only so much, and as a beginning writer without the budget to hire a researcher, I had to do the work myself. By the time I reached Atlanta, I was exhausted from driving and eager to find a hotel where I could rest before the long journey home. My plan included half a day's work, with 2 extra days set aside for sightseeing and relaxation. I made it there just in time, as I had been nodding off at the wheel for the last hour. Since I wasn't wealthy, I had to find a budget-friendly place to stay. After a bit of searching, I came across a decent mid-range motel and pulled in. The guy at the counter was kind, though a little unkempt, and eager to help me check in. As I stood at the desk, a couple walked in, engaged in a full-blown argument. Like anyone else, I glanced at them, curious about what was going on. But the man noticed me and snapped, "What are you looking at?" I was caught off guard and simply shrugged, unsure of how to respond. His next words stunned me. "Mind your business, or I'll black your eye." His aggressive tone left me confused and a little afraid, but before I could react, he stormed out of the lobby, the woman following after him as their argument continued. I looked at the front desk clerk to gauge his reaction, but his expression showed that he was well accustomed to this kind of scene. Bewildered, I took my key and headed to my room. To my dismay, I quickly realized that the arguing couple was only 2 doors down from me. Their door was wide open, and the man paced back and forth with a beer can in hand, clearly intoxicated. Luckily, they didn't notice me, as they were too focused on their shouting match. I finally felt some relief once I shut my door and enjoyed the quiet. Unfortunately, that peace didn't last long. The motel's air conditioner hummed loudly, lulling me to sleep, but by evening I was jolted awake by a deafening racket, something akin to a cannon blast. Groggy, I peeked through the corner of my curtain. The noise was, once again, coming from that couple. Boxes were being thrown out of their room and into the parking lot. The man was now stumbling around, yelling in a slurred voice, and the walls of the building shook with loud bangs. Despite there being an empty room between us, I could still clearly hear the woman shouting back at him. I'm not someone who enjoys confrontation, especially after what had happened earlier, so I tried to ignore them. I turned up the television in hopes of drowning out the noise, But after 30 minutes of non-stop chaos, I decided to call the front desk. I politely asked if the clerk could convince them to quiet down since he seemed to know them. And I also requested that he not mention who had complained. He assured me he wouldn't, but once I thought about it, I realized it would be pretty obvious that it was me. I turned back to my TV, hoping my call would make a difference. At first, it seemed to work. The noise stopped completely. Relieved, I leaned back on the headboard and sighed, and then came the knock. At first, I hesitated, thinking it might be a bad idea to answer. But then I considered the possibility that they had realized they were disturbing me and wanted to apologize. That naive hope is what led me to open the door, easily one of the worst decisions I've ever made. I answered with a polite, disarming smile, but the man standing before me had no intention of apologizing. My smile quickly vanished. "Listen here, you uppity Yankee," he spat, his words slurred. "If you make one more complaint, I'm going to kick your backside all the way back across the Mason-Dixon line." His words, laced with hostility, felt like something out of the 19th century. As he spoke, gobs of spit flew in my face. I was stunned, both by his aggression and by the sheer outdated hatred in his words. I knew that kind of resentment still existed, but to hear it firsthand was shocking. Though I was terrified, especially as a woman alone far from home, a small part of me was fascinated by how archaic he sounded. But fear outweighed curiosity. My silence seemed to anger him further, and his face grew redder. I needed to end this. Summoning whatever courage I had, I said firmly, "Look, mister, if you don't leave me alone this second, I'm calling the police." For a brief moment, I thought my words had worked. But instead of backing down, he lunged toward me. Panicked, I shoved the door shut and locked it just in time. The police arrived quickly after I reported the incident. I gave my statement, including what he had said earlier that day. Considering his intoxicated state, the officers decided to arrest him for public drunkenness and took him into custody. His girlfriend, however, had remained strangely quiet throughout the entire ordeal. But as soon as the police were gone, she turned to me and sneered, "Dirty Yankee. I'm calling my brother up here and they're going to take turns tearing you up." She left her door open so I could hear her making the phone call. Whether she was serious or not, I wasn't going to take any chances. I had had enough of these two hillbillies and their threats. I quickly packed up my belongings and got into my car. I drove around until I found a far nicer hotel and checked in, even though it was more expensive. My safety was worth it. Thanks to that insane encounter, I decided to finish my work and drive straight home, cutting my trip short by 2 days. The drive was exhausting, but with the help of many cups of coffee, I made it home safely. Now I know there will be comments saying, "Not all Southerners are like that," and I completely agree. Many of my colleagues are Southerners, and they are wonderful people. The world has become much more interconnected, and thankfully, I haven't had to take research trips like that in years. But if I ever do, and I happen to visit Atlanta again, one thing is for certain, crazy man and bloodthirsty woman, let's never meet again. This afternoon, while browsing Reddit, I stumbled upon this subreddit for the first time. Even though I'm a huge coward when it comes to anything scary, this feels like the perfect place to share a terrifying incident that happened to my cousins and me 15 years ago. At the time, I was approaching my 16th birthday. Every year, my family held a big reunion in Southern California, but I hadn't attended since I was little. My parents thought it would be a great way to spend my summer break and get to know my cousins, 3 girls around my age. After thinking about it, I agreed and flew to Los Angeles the next month. The reunion was at the same hotel where we were staying. When I arrived, my cousins, Jennifer, Belinda, and Stormy, greeted me. It was shocking how much we looked alike. We all had long blonde hair, blue eyes, and similar facial features, which made sense since our dads were brothers. The biggest difference was their tans. Having spent all winter in Minnesota, I was much paler. Our dads decided we could share a room, a big, fancy bridal suite. When we saw it, we joked that we were sisters celebrating a bachelorette party. I was chosen as the bride, since I was the oldest, and looked a little different, like an older sister often does. We spent the day at the pool talking to guys. Stormy, who was only 14, managed to trick a 25-year-old man into thinking she was 19, and even got his number. We were having so much fun that we stayed up talking and laughing until 4 a.m. The next day, we ordered breakfast and headed back to the pool. It was even more fun than the day before. Stormy got a pair of twins to buy her lunch. She was on fire that week. That evening, we dressed up and had dinner at the hotel's restaurant. By this time, our little joke had taken on a life of its own. My cousins had been telling people all day that we were there to party and even tried getting men to buy them drinks. Most weren't fooled, but we were still enjoying ourselves. After dinner, we met two older guys in the lobby who invited us to sit with them. Since we had nothing else to do, we agreed. They asked our ages and names, and of course we lied, saying we were in our early 20s. They actually believed us. I couldn't help but giggle. It was the most fun I'd had in years. Jennifer and I stayed quiet, letting Belinda and Stormy do most of the talking. At one point, Stormy invited them up to our room, but I quickly pulled her aside and reminded her that our dad's room was right next door. I didn't want to be a buzzkill, but I wasn't comfortable letting two strange men, who looked around 30, into our room. It was approaching midnight, so I told the younger girls it was time to head back. They protested at first, but once Jennifer backed me up, they gave in. We told the guys to meet us at the pool the next day at 11 a.m. for lunch, and then headed upstairs. We stayed up talking about them until about 2 a.m., then finally decided to go to bed. Just as we turned off the lights, we heard the doorknob jiggling, fast, like someone was trying to get in. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but when it happened again, I got scared. I asked the others if they heard it too, and they all said yes. Without thinking, Belinda jumped up, saying she'd check who it was. I yelled at her to stop, but it was too late. Jennifer turned on the lights, and we rushed to the door. Belinda opened it, turned to us and said no one was there, then stepped into the hallway. That's when we saw it. A person in a black mask jumped out and grabbed her. Belinda started screaming and fighting to get away. The rest of us screamed, running toward her. The masked person was dragging her toward the elevator, and despite her efforts to fight back, she was losing. Then, just as she was being pulled closer to the elevator, my uncle burst out of his room. Seeing Belinda being dragged away, he didn't hesitate. He attacked the man. He struck him across the head several times until the attacker finally let go of Belinda and ran off toward the stairwell, disappearing. We ran to Belinda, checking if she was okay. She was terrified, but thankfully unharmed. My uncle immediately called hotel security, who then contacted the police. The four of us sat together, shaking and crying, relieved that she was safe. Despite security locking the doors, the attacker managed to escape. When the police arrived, we tried to describe him, but since he was wearing all black and a mask, we had little to go on. Belinda was sure it was a man, but that was all we knew. Over the next few days, we spoke with the police multiple times, going over everything we had done that week. When my uncle learned about our bachelorette party joke and how we'd been lying about our ages, he was furious. The police believed that one of the men we had spoken to was likely the attacker. Their theory was chilling. He had intended to kidnap one of us, maybe for human trafficking. Since we all looked alike, it didn't matter which of us opened the door. They explained that girls like us were in high demand in other parts of the world, and traffickers would pay top dollar for someone like us. We were horrified. The rest of the week, we stayed in our room, refusing to answer the door for anyone without a key. As soon as the police cleared me to leave, I took the first flight back to Minnesota. For a long time after, I was terrified of strangers. I had to go to counseling to deal with the trauma, and my cousins did too. They also struggled with trusting boys they had just met. Unfortunately, the police never found the attacker. Sometimes when I'm at Disneyland with my family, I catch myself scanning the crowd, wondering if one of the men walking past could be the one who tried to take Belinda that night. Then a shiver runs down my spine, and I remember it could have just as easily been me. My friend and I are having a contest to see who had the scariest experience in our lives, and I am positive that once you hear mine, he'll declare me the winner. You may have already read his story about the broken window and the guy in the woods, but I assure you mine is much scarier. This happened when I was 15 years old. Although I'm 25 now, I still don't know what to make of it. At that time, my life was enjoyable, and it even reflected in my dreams. Most of the ones I remembered had a positive theme. Sure, I had nightmares occasionally, but they were either mild or forgotten quickly. That was about to change during a family vacation to Branson, Missouri. Each year, my family chose a new vacation spot, and that year, it was Branson. We had been there when I was around 10 or 11. But since then, more attractions had opened up, particularly musical theaters. We had just driven in from Oklahoma City, and everyone in the car was exhausted. Thankfully, my parents were meticulous planners, so our hotel rooms were ready upon arrival. Since my brother and I were getting older and more responsible, we were given our own room, or maybe my parents just wanted some privacy. Either way, we didn't mind. The room was great, with a small living area and a TV. We played Call of Duty for about an hour before deciding to crash for the night. The next morning, as expected, our parents had us up at the crack of dawn. I never understood why they did this. Wasn't vacation supposed to be about rest and relaxation? Instead, we were up at 8 a.m., only to wait another 2 hours for them to get ready. Once we left, my dad drove like he was on a mission while constantly yelling at Jeff and me. I never understood why he was so stressed, and maybe that's why I now prefer staying home during holidays. We did the usual tourist activities in Branson, riding the ducks and visiting various attractions. By 5 p.m., we were back at the hotel to freshen up before heading out to dinner. My dad had planned for us to see some hillbilly-style performance, but our plans changed when my brother got sick during dinner. The rest of the evening was spent in our room, playing the Wii. By bedtime, Jeff was feeling better, so we stayed up a little longer gaming. I finally called it a night around midnight and quickly drifted off to sleep. Then she came. I'm not sure when exactly, but I had been asleep for quite a while when I first became aware of my surroundings. I could see most of the room, but my body wouldn't move. At first, I wasn't alarmed. Maybe I was just waking up slowly. Jeff was sprawled out in his bed as usual, half covered by the blankets. The low hum of the air conditioner filled the room, but it sounded quieter than I remembered. That's when I noticed something at the edge of my vision. I tried to turn my head to get a better look, but I couldn't move. A shadowy figure loomed near the foot of my bed. My eyes shifted, and suddenly hers met mine. At first, I only saw her eyes, but then her head emerged from the darkness, growing larger until it was all I could see. A chilling fear gripped me as I realized she was crawling onto my bed. Panic surged through me, but my body refused to obey. I was frozen, trapped in place as she inched closer. Her cold, bony hands touched me, and I wanted to shrink away, to scream, anything, but I couldn't. Tears streamed down my temples as sheer terror consumed me. She kept climbing until her grotesque face was mere inches from mine. She looked like a stereotypical old witch, with hairy moles on her chin and black, crooked teeth. Her breath was a nauseating mixture of rotting flesh and musty air. When she saw my tears, she cackled with delight, running her filthy, claw-like fingers in circles on my chest. Her weight pressed down on me, making it harder to breathe. It became clear she was trying to suffocate me. I fought desperately to move, to break free, but nothing worked. My lungs burned as I struggled for air. Just as I took what I thought would be my last breath, I woke up. Gasping for air, my body took over, desperate to recover. I was hyperventilating, my heart pounding. It took a minute before I could control my breathing and process what had happened. I lay there, still frozen in fear, before slowly sitting up to check my body for any scratches or marks. There were none. I scanned the room, but Jeff remained in the same sleeping position as before, and there was no sign of the witch. Had I really been asleep? If it was just a nightmare, how had I seen everything in the room so clearly? The thought terrified me. I couldn't go back to sleep, so I turned on the TV and played games until my mom knocked on the door at 7:45 a.m. I was relieved when our trip ended, though I wasn't the only one. Everyone seemed happy to go home. For a week after that night, I was too afraid to sleep, but as time passed and the witch never returned, life gradually returned to normal. However, the fear that she might come back still lingers in my mind. At least once a week, I question whether that was just sleep paralysis or something far more sinister. I've done some research on sleep paralysis and learned that the hag, as many call her, is a common entity associated with the phenomenon. If what I experienced was merely a terrifying dream, I hope I've outgrown it. But if that witch and her kind are real, I can only pray that they got what they wanted that night, and that they never return, especially now that I have a newborn son.